Hey there, listener. Welcome to the Deep Share Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rouse, and for the last couple of decades, I've slowly been opening my eyes to a very different world than the one I grew up hearing about. And the more conversations I have with interesting people, the more mystifying this world becomes. So without further ado, let's get deep.
We've got science to celebrate! Demons bliss out! After what, baby? Come on!
There is rebellion in the wind. It will crush.
Everything I've said is true. It's real.
Dinosaur fossils? God put those here to test our faith.
A damn lie. I saw them with my own eye.
Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away?
We did illusions, man! None of it is true!
I'm not insane!
This is mass madness, you maniacs! In God's name, you people are the real thing! We are the illusion!
Welcome back to another Deep Share. Tonight, I'm here with someone I've wanted to talk to for quite a while, and we finally got it figured out. And, I've always kind of looked into the topics of the occult and with a grain of salt, because so many people have so many different theories. And this man in particular, I've really jived with a lot of interesting theories that he's put forward on his blog, The Secret Sun. So please welcome Christoper Knowles. Chris, how's it going, man?
It's going great. Glad we got this together.
Hell yeah. Yeah, it's been a while, and I'm glad we got it going. So for my audience who may not be familiar with your work, would you mind giving a little bit of background about how you got into your blog, The Secret Sun? You started back in like 2007, right?
Correct. Yeah, this is the 15th year, coming up on the 15th year anniversary.
Congratulations, man.
Yeah. Well, it had an interesting genesis. I mean, I'd been doing, what came to be called synchronistic work since the early 90s. But I was sort of operating on a Jungian framework. I was really interested in Jung, was really interested in a book he wrote called Man and His Symbols. And that kind of had a huge influence on me. And I just started doing that work myself. What happened is that I got a book deal for Our Gods Wear Spandex. And, I really needed to push it because there was a lot of resistance to the book from mainstream comic book world, which is, very infantile world that doesn't like their illusions being challenged. Mm-hmm. So I started the blog initially to put all these ideas forward. First of all, a lot of the stuff that ended up getting cut on the final draft of the book, because if you're familiar with book publishing, commercial book publishing, they are just ridiculous with the word counts. They just slash them to the bone, and that's one of the reasons why I stopped working for those companies, because it's just pathetic. You can't make a coherent argument with the word counts they give you. Mm-hmm. And it was when I did the Secret History of Rock and Roll book that really just said, I'm done, I'm out. Yeah, because I had to fight tooth and nail to get a decent word count. And, even then it was just ridiculous. And the book publishers, they don't do anything. You have to do your own promotion and everything. It's just, it's a pathetic little world. I don't know why everybody doesn't just self-publish. If you have a platform and you have a following, it's total waste of time to go through a publisher. Believe me. In this day and age, especially. Yeah. Yeah. It's not worth your time. And they just, nickel and dime you to death. So before I did The Secret Sun, I had a blog. Do you remember Zanga? Yeah. On that platform, Zanga? Yeah. So I had a Zanga blog that I did for a while. And then this friend of mine asked me to join Tribe. I don't remember tribe.net. Oh, wow. Kind of got real weird real
These
quick.
Some old terms coming back.
Yeah.
From
so
dial-up days.
Yeah. Right. So, it started out really interesting, and then it just became big pickup scene for swingers and stuff. But so I was doing some work on that. And then I was sort of cross-posting from the stuff I was writing on Tribe to Zanga. Mm-hmm. And then I got this book deal, and I needed to do some promotion. And, like I said, I ran into a lot of hostility from the mainstream comics world and so on. I mean, it was just not.
I'm assuming that one of the biggest criticisms was like that you're just looking too far into things or something. That sounds like a typical surface level response from any normal person looking into just comic books for the fun of it, right?
Well, the thing you have to realize about people who are into comic books is that they're looking to escape reality.
Sure.
And if you challenge that, if you open the door in any way to let sort of the sunlight in on their little fantasy worlds, they get very upset about it. They get very offended. Okay. And plus, I kind of like, I don't know, I think I misread the audience a little bit because I was on this big anti-90s comics kick, like superhero comics. And I think a lot of people kind of got offended by that. Well, you know, I don't care. It's
ripping those apart or something?
Yeah, well, you know, like all the stuff in the early 90s, the image stuff, and you know, a lot of this what they call the chromium age. And the thing is that, you know, it was at that point in time that I started working for Marvel. I mean, I was working for Marvel when there was still Toy Biz.
Oh wow, I didn't even know that, man.
Yeah. I mean, I worked for them for like 25 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah. And so I was doing a lot of well, it's funny too, because I remember one time my wife and I think one of my sons went into no, it's actually, I think it was both of my sons. We went into the Toys R Us in here, and like one half of the aisle, the action figure aisle, was all my stuff. Like it was all my stuff. It's like just a wall of Chris Knowles.
Oh wow, that's cool.
So yeah. So then I did work for like the movies and stuff for, like I said, 25 years. And now, I mean, that whole thing is just collapsing.
So now my frame of reference for the backlash that you got is painted in much more detail. The amount of criticism you must have received for a book bashing, or not bashing, just kind of pulling back the cover of the sheath or what have you of the comic book world. Yeah, I can see how that would have. Yeah.
Well, the other thing too is that this was the whole height of like the whole Fedora era, let's just say, you know, when like the online skeptics and atheists were really prominent, really dominant, you know, like the whole Richard Dawkins,
Sam Harris was king,
and Amazing Randy, and just all these weirdos and freaks.
Yep.
And you know, it's interesting because I was just at war with that stuff from day one, and it turns out I was right.
That's awesome. I was with them for the longest time before I was like, wait a minute. They're missing half the story.
Yeah, well, at least. Yeah,
at least.
But, you know, the thing is that I grew up reading comics. I mean, I started reading by reading comics. And this is like 1970, maybe. Maybe. I mean, I was three and a half years old when I started reading. And I can remember to this day, like, how it happened. I was underneath. So my mother was a musician, right? And she was... I was always just dragged around from all these different places, and I was at her partner's house. You know, her musical partner, this woman, and her husband and her family. They lived in Marshfield, really nice house in Marshfield. And I was underneath the dining room table, and I had like this coverless Superboy 80-page giant that, you know, I got from, like, you know, my grandmother had it from when my uncles were kids, and I just started understanding what the words meant. Wow. You know what I mean? Like I just started putting it together. Like it was like just like that. So you know, and I was sick a lot too, so I had a lot of time to just sit around and read and everything. But anyway, the point is that I was reading comics like in the 70s when, like, you know, like Alan Moore kind of comics were not unusual. It was like you had a lot of that kind of stuff, you know, conspiracy, occult, paranormal, UFOs. I mean, you name it.
Right.
That was like that. That's what the guys were doing, because there was a lot of these hippie freaks, you know. I remember, like, so I went to work for Comic Book Artist magazine in the late 90s. I mean, it was a part-time thing, but I was like an associate editor, and I did a lot of interviews. And I remember interviewing gosh, I forget who it was. I think it was Terry Austin, who was an X-Men inker. And you know, he'd talk about how these guys would just like just trip balls and just wander around Manhattan all night in the 70s. You know what I mean? I mean, just like Death Wish kind of stuff. And but you know, it really showed, you know, with all the cosmic freak out kind of stuff. And but you know, Watchmen. And then well, Watchmen was a bit later, but like Jack Kirby, like all the crazy stuff he was doing, because I am convinced that you know, because he he was a frontline combat guy, reconnaissance guy. I'm convinced that he had PTSD and they dosed him with something
probably
in the 60s in like a VA hospital, because he just went from being just like, pretty standard, but, exciting kind of comic product, just being, everything was just buzzing energy and cosmic freakouts and all the rest of it, just totally psychedelic, like
drastic change.
Overnight. I mean, you can just look at the point where it just, like Fantastic Four, whatever. And then like the next cover is like, you know what I mean? So he just, I don't know. I think acid and all that kind of stuff had a lot to do with it. But anyway, so, that's the stuff that I grew up reading. Mm-hmm. And so it was natural to me. And I didn't understand all the hostility that I was getting from all these like geeks. But, the thing is that, I went to the Kubert School for a year. Kubert School is like a big comic book art school. Mm-hmm. In Dover. That's why I'm down in Jersey in the first place. But
okay.
But I was so incredibly disillusioned, and I did a few comics here and there, but it's so friggin' tedious. I mean, you really have to be like deep in the spectrum to do that work on a regular basis. It's so friggin' boring. I don't think people really understand how boring that work is, and how like you just need a special kind of brain to do that kind of work. But anyway, so like I said, the Our Gods Wear Spandex was really kind of the impetus for it, and then it just totally went in all these different directions from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for those who haven't read it, and it's a fantastic book, I recommend it to everybody. Could you go into a little bit of what you talk about in that book? Because I feel like it's, in a way, it's a big foundation, obviously, to what you still talk about today in a lot of ways.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how it started.
Sure.
Okay? I'll tell you how it started. So I was working in New York for years, right? I was actually in the Empire State Building for, oh gosh, how many? 88 to 95, so it'd be
like 7 years.
7, 8 years, yeah. I was working in the Empire State Building, right there on 33rd Street. And then I had a buddy of mine was from Colombia. He came from Colombia, and he started out, before he became an artist, he was doing delivery work. So he knew like the ins and outs of all these like places around Grand Central, Madison Avenue, Murray Hill near the UN. So he knew like the ins and outs, and he would take me on these tours, right? Where you go into these lobbies and you swear to God, it was like walking into like a pagan temple from like the 1st century BC. It was all just done up. A lot of this comes from like the Art Deco period and the sort of the neoclassical revival period and so on. But I was just stunned by how much of there was. And then going to Rockefeller Center, which is just basically a giant open air temple to Mithras. And then of course you got the big Hermetic temple of Grand Central Station. And it's like most people just walk around and they don't notice it. They don't just like look up a little. And if you just look up a little, like I said, go into some of these lobbies, whatever, you just start poking around. It boggles your mind. And to me, like I put myself in the head of all these like comic book artists in the the 30s and 40s, these kids, coming in, a lot of them from like Brooklyn or whatever, or Bronx, Lower East Side, coming into like downtown Manhattan, midtown Manhattan, and just seeing like, the gods everywhere, right? And and that's why you had so many characters in the comics that were based on the gods. You know what I mean? Like directly, like the Flash was, obviously Mercury, and Superman was obviously Hercules, and Batman is the devil, right? The Batman, and so on. And Wonder Woman is Athena. Just up and down the line, and there's just so many of these things, And it just occurred to me that it was like there was some sort of transmission from like the ancient world to like all this neoclassicism that you saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? That everybody was doing. Like the Germans and the Russians and the English. It was just really popular, right? It's sort of come to be associated with fascism, but it was everywhere. It was universal. So it just occurred to me, like what was the what's the midpoint here? So we've got like the ancient world, right? And then we've got this neoclassical revival stuff, late 19th century. Like, how are we getting from that into the comic books? And then I realized that it's like, if you look at a lot of these occult groups going back to like the Industrial Revolution, Victorian era in England, there was a huge crossover between these groups and like quote unquote fantastic fiction. You know what I'm saying? A lot of these, there was a huge influence. So theosophy got really, really big.
Right.
And theosophy was incredibly influential on the superheroes. So this is the early superheroes. We're talking like, Tarzan, John Carter of Mars, both Edgar Rice Burroughs. He was huge into the theosophy stuff. Doc Savage, the Shadow, the Spider. I mean, all these characters that were the original superheroes, right? They didn't wear like the costumes. Like the first superhero really to wear the costume was the Phantom, and that's a whole other discussion. But they were superheroes, and it's like, Batman is just the Shadow. It's just a total ripoff of the Shadow, right? I mean, Superman incorporates Doc Savage and also this pulp novel called Gladiator. I mean, it's like these are just kids, and they're just ripping off the stuff. I mean, sometimes
just recycled,
just absolutely like outright tracing shit. You know what I mean? Just like tracing stuff over and then putting a different costume on it. So, but I realized that it was the occult revolution of the late 19th century that was feeding this stuff into the popular culture. Because then you have people like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and Sax Rohmer. Sax Rohmer was huge into the occult. Dion Fortune, is probably better known as a occultist than she is as a novelist, but she was writing like occult detective stuff. So there's this whole like very rich world where pulp and the occult were kind of coalescing, on top of all this neoclassical godlike imagery that these kids would have been seeing, and they're going into Midtown Manhattan to pick up jobs and stuff, or work, at the studios, whatever they were doing. It was all new to them. And it's like the missing ingredient for the superheroes as they came to be during the 40s was the gods, like literally the gods. I mean, the gods that kids would be seeing everywhere.
Right.
What I mean? But it was not only just like in the city, but it was, it was in the culture as well. So, and then I realized that's how it all came together. That's how it all came together. And in the 60s, when the superheroes really make a huge comeback, because the superheroes were kind of dead after the war. I mean, it was kind of over. Like they kept a lot of these books being published to just keep the trademarks and copyrights fresh. But a lot of these, they're just selling for shit. And then we saw in the early 60s and late 50s, like what's called the Silver Age, and it starts with the Flash and Hawkman, a lot of these DC characters, and then the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Hulk, the Avengers, Iron Man, all these characters that just made billions and billions of dollars for Disney, start up in the early 80s. So a lot of what's happening in that incarnation is the quote unquote space age, right? Because when the whole Sputnik thing and Yuri Gagarin and all this kind of stuff really got this whole Cold War competition going on. But it was also all the MK Ultra stuff that was seeping into the culture, right? And also, so it's like you have this mix with the MK Ultra stuff and all this other kind of thing. And then I realized that another thing that was really firing it is that there was this huge explosion of movies from Italy in the late 50s called Peplum. That was the Italian name, but it was Sword and Sandal, right? And it was all because there was a Hercules movie made with a bodybuilder named Steve Reeves. That was a huge hit. And, the Italians were just great knockoff artists, and they did just a ton of knockoffs of these characters and so on. And that was like, that brought, and, that was be like every grindhouse and drive-in theater that you can imagine. And that's like, it's like, that's how the gods reinsert themselves into the timeline through these kind of like junk culture artifacts. So that's really like basically the the basic argument that I put forward, which I didn't think would be, to me, it doesn't seem terribly controversial. I mean, it's all pretty well documented. I mean, you can draw a pretty clear timeline for all this stuff. I didn't understand why people were resistant to it, but I didn't understand, the full desire or, need to disentangle yourself from anything remotely resembling reality. But I got some really funny bad reviews, and I'd love to get the Comics Journal. I mean, they don't publish it anymore, but they wrote this like really hilariously over the top negative review of it. And it's like, I know why they wrote it, because this guy was showing up at the blog and leaving these comments and stuff, and people were just busting on him. So he was, he's like, oh, that fucking guy is readers of insulting me. I'm going to go after his book. But anyway, but the thing is that, so what had happened is that the Secret Sun really kind of takes off with like the 2008 presidential election, because I start noticing all this like occult symbolism being woven into that, particularly the stairway to Sirius, Orion and the glyph of Sirius. And also Orion was associated with the Nephilim. The belt of Orion was associated with the Nephilim. So, so that was a huge, and just going into all this serious stuff. And there was a lot of like weird kind of solar, like all these kind of occult symbolic things kind of go, and it's just like anything else. They're just like fads and trends and so on, and just started following that. But unfortunately, at the same time, I started getting real sick. So, I wasn't really able to take it anywhere. And, the blog kind of like just was on, it's like in a holding pattern until May 18th, 2017, when Chris Cornell died. And then everything just exploded completely. And, and that led to all the siren stuff. And, it was phase 2. And it was interesting too, because it was 10 years after I'd started, or almost 10 years. So it was like phase 2. And then there was the whole thing in Las Vegas. I've told the story before, but when all that was going down with Mandalay Bay and everything, I was on the radio that night with Richard Hoagland, and his show at the time was being broadcast out of Las Vegas. So this stuff all starts going down as we're recording, right?
Whoa.
And and we kept trying to so I told him, I said, listen, this thing is just crazy. There's all the symbolism stuff. I want to do a show on it. And like every time we started to do a show, like the feed would get cut, and like all this stuff was going on. And finally he just quit that station and went to like Blog Talk Radio or something, But it was crazy. Talk about synchronicities, right?
Yeah.
But it was like I had been talking about Las Vegas, since Chris Cornell died, because of Heaven Las Vegas, and that's that sort of ties in the siren stuff and ties in his death and so on. So yeah, and then it's just kept growing and growing from that point on. But it's like I've always been like, well, first of all, up until a couple years ago, I was kind of doing it part-time, because I was, like I said, I was freelancing for Marvel, and that work was just really backbreaking work. And it wasn't until the whole Corona thing kicks in. But at the same time, and Marvel's doing what they call Phase 4, which is all these like crappy second string characters, and and it just and they're really doing serious damage to the brand right now. And I don't think any of that stuff, like I haven't heard from anybody at Marvel in like 2.5 years now, because I don't think there's any work. I mean, I don't think kids want like an Eternals bed set. I mean, those toys, just none of them sold. Shang-Chi, Black Widow. I mean, these are all, the funny thing about it too, is that these are all the characters that, like, when the whole first flush of the Marvel universe, like I said, with Fantastic Four and X-Men and Spider-Man and all those kinds of things, when that started to kind of wind down in the early 70s, then they started doing all these characters that they're doing with the Phase 4, such as like Eternals and Shang-Chi and Black Widow and all this other kind of stuff. That
Black Adam,
Black Panther. Well, Black Adam.
Is that DC?
That's a different character.
I get mixed up.
Like Black Panther.
Or maybe I'm thinking there is an Adam, right, in Marvel. It's connected
the
to
little
like Guardian.
shrinky guy. Yeah, he's kind of like the Ant-Man. But
Oh,
but the
okay.
funny thing is that I mean, I really love those. I mean, I love the Eternals. I love Black Panther. I love Shang-Chi. I love Doctor Strange. I mean, I loved all these. Those are like my favorite characters at the time. I mean, I wasn't reading like Spider-Man at that point in time because that to me was just old hat.
Yeah.
Captain Marvel before they gave him gender reassignment surgery.
Of course, you have to. You know? Just like Ariel has to be made over, right?
Well, not only they did it twice though. I mean, because not only did they give like the nominal Captain Marvel character a sex change, they did the same thing with Marvel. Because it's a long story, but he's like an alien and so on, and they had that character being played by. That sex change character played by Annette Bening.
Oh, okay.
But I'll tell you something. So the real moneymaker, the real gravy for those movies was the merchandising.
Really?
Right. The licensing. Yeah. Toys, T-shirts, lunchboxes. Right, because all right, so you put out an Avengers movie and it's going to make I don't know like $1 billion or something, right? But those all the merchandising is just the merch is just going to sell way past the date that movie is out of the theaters. You know what I mean? Sometimes for years. I mean, look what happened with Star Wars, right?
Right.
And Star Wars had been out of the theaters for years, and it was still selling. I mean, from what, like, Return of the Jedi to Phantom Menace. I mean, that was what, like 16 years.
Yeah, within that 16 years, I was a little boy back in the 80s and had like brand new from the store Star Wars stuff when there were no Star Wars movies going on in the early 90s, late 80s.
Well, that's how George Lucas got so rich. So what happened is that now this is an interesting story. So what happened is that in the 70s, science fiction was dead. Like you had a little burst in the like around 74 and stuff with the Planet of the Apes thing got big again because it was a TV series and they released some of those movies into the theaters and such, and the toys and everything. I mean, I love that stuff. That was kind of like my jam. I mean, I love Star Wars and stuff, but I was starting to like, I was like real precocious about being a feral reprobate. So it wasn't long for that stuff, right?
Yeah.
But So I mean, it was dead, and then like a couple of years before Star Wars came out, there was Logan's Run, and that that did okay, but so
I think it's more popular now than it was back then.
Yeah, but so George Lucas said to Fox, he said, well, they're making the deals and stuff. And he goes, well, I just want the rights to the toys and stuff. I just want the rights to the merch. And Fox was like, okay. Good luck to you. See you later. You can have all you want, buddy, right? Yeah. You're going to be a billionaire. And of course, he was a billionaire. I mean, those toys were.
Lucas is from the future or something.
Yeah, that was
him huge. And Matt Groening are travelers from another world or something.
Matt Groening, yeah. I met him. I met Matt Groening at San Diego Comic-Con. He was actually a really nice guy. But The Simpsons. It's so far. I mean, The Simpsons is so far past the date of being a rotted corpse.
I know.
It's funny because I feel sorry for the people who work on that show. That it's like a golden parachute because I'm sure they throw them a lot of money to keep this stupid thing going, even though it's supposed to be the last year. Actually, one of my old roommates from like when I first came down to Jersey and I was going to comic book school and stuff, became a director on the Simpsons.
Wow.
And for all I know, he might still be. But I mean, I haven't watched The Simpsons since Bill Clinton was in office.
Yeah, I would say so. That's probably watching. About it. I mean, I would say the same to South Park. It wasn't long for me before I just got tired of their take on everything.
Well, the shows are so cheap to produce.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And
the Simpsons thing is just a side note real quick. Like, what is your thoughts on like the synchromysticism of all the shit that's like quote unquote predicted in the Simpsons? Because personally, I'm on a show every week with a few of my friends called Sync Tank, and we talk about stuff like synchromysticism and, synchronicities themselves all the time, and how, attributing all these things to like humans doing, now put that color in there. Maybe some of it could be purposeful, but some of it almost seems like cosmic order type shit. I mean, we're getting a little far ahead of ourselves, but.
Well, the thing is, it's all the above.
Right.
It's all the above, because a lot of it, one thing that I think is undervalued with a lot of people who do sync work is like the whole idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. You put these ideas out there and they kind of soak in, to the public mind, they soak into the collective unconscious. So they're going to have, a really strong influence, I mean, the stuff that I'm mostly interested in when it comes to sync work is the stuff that like nobody had any exposure to, it was things that are just totally obscure. The Simpsons is not obscure.
No.
You know what I mean? So I think, there are any number of things going on, right? There are any number of things going on. I think that it's, part of it is, like I said, just pure synchronicity. Part of it is predictive programming, right?
Okay.
And part of it is, like I said, the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
I mean, part of it just might be like, just totally random. I mean, it's like, how many episodes of that damn show are there?
Yeah, I've heard that angle of it. Yeah, it's like they're gonna cover all of reality at some point. That idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they have a lot of opportunities to get things right and to get things wrong. So fair. I mean, for every dead on prediction that they make, I'm sure there are like 100 that they just don't go anywhere. I mean, it's like I said, it's a huge show.
Yeah,
it's been on forever. They've done every storyline that you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
So it's just,
that's cool.
It's just
cool.
the world. It's just the world. I mean, it is. I mean, it's just the world. It's just like.
I think this is part of the process
really
of getting over the fact that, the reality is this way, even for someone like me, who's kind of, soft accepted it for decades. It's still this like, really, it's like everything is kind of a reflection back at us. It's almost like the universe just showing us shit that happens. Like, have you ever seen the connection from like Back to the Future to 9/11? It's not like Robert Zemeckis is necessarily doing all those things on purpose. It's almost like reality is just reflecting it back at us, whatever's going on some level.
Well, see, there's another thing too, though. There's another thing that you have to remember.
Sure.
Sitting in a room with a blank piece of paper or a blank screen and just your imagination is exactly how they did remote viewing for 25, 30 years, right?
That's true.
That's exactly what they did with those guys. They just put them in a room with a piece of paper and a pencil, and that's what artists do. And, that's what writers do. I mean, it's like,
true.
You're going to be just pulling stuff in, you're just going to be pulling stuff in. So like I said, it's all of the above.
It's both. Yeah.
It's a little of everything.
Okay.
The thing that I always say though, with like the stuff that I don't see the powers that be being tremendously imaginative people.
Not creators.
Not creative. I think that one thing that I noticed, when they really want to put something out there, they just hit you over the head with it. Bang, 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 bang. I mean, look at the COVID thing.
Right.
Look at the trans thing. I mean, look at everything that they do. A couple years ago with the Black Lives Matter thing, when they want to get the message across, they just punch you in the face.
That's a really
constantly.
Good point.
I mean, they're not. The more subtle or random it is, the more likely it is to be just something else than predictive programming or whatever. I mean, or spellcraft. I mean, that's, I'm kind of like, I've transcended the whole idea of you talked about revelation of the method, and you talked about, predictive programming stuff. It's like, I had a real hard time with that stuff for years. And it just didn't make any sense to me. until I learned about ritual magic. And then it like a light went on over my head. It's like, oh shit, this is spellcraft. That's what this really is. It's sorcery, and it's sorceress entrainment is what's really going on. So like, you know, I mean, there are any kind of number of things that you can put into it. But the thing that I was always like, I don't know, just like the kind of like vigilant citizen kind of mindset. I always just had it just didn't make any sense to me. Like the explanations for why this stuff is showing up and everything just didn't make any sense.
That's where I'm at.
Yeah. But you know, when it all fell together is when I started learning about ritual magic and sorcery, because that's really what it is. It's sorcery. It's sorceress entrainment. Right.
And we have to remember they're working on the subconscious, not the conscious. So you have to kind of stop looking at things logically when you're kind of understanding this stuff to begin with, in a way.
The work, but it's almost like a liminal state between the conscious and the unconscious. Right. That's really how this stuff operates. It operates in that twilight zone, let's just say.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you know, that really kind of informs my work, you know.
Yeah,
and
I guess I'll have to look into it further than I have.
Yeah.
Would you say revelation of method is part of that ritualistic method? Because it kind of feels like Shelby Downard framed it that way. Like these were like deep, dark occultists doing these workings through revelation of method. What would you say to that?
I think that's, well, like I said, that's interpretive. That's an interpretation. I've never read, you know, outside of Downard or Hoffman, I've never read anybody actually use that term.
I know.
You know, predating them.
I've tried. I've scoured everything looking for it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just them.
It is interpretive. You know, it might make a lot of sense, right? It might make a lot of sense in the long run. But one of the problems that I had, something that I was trying to tell people, particularly in the early days of the blog, is like, don't assume that a lot of this symbolism is meant for your benefit. I mean, these are occultists signaling each other, you know, using the mass media, architecture, events, sports, games, all these kind of things to signal each other. They don't give a shit whether you get the message or not. You know, they're not talking to you. They're not talking to us. They're talking to each other. And I think that's something, you know, with the revelation of the method stuff, that's where, you know, a lot of times it would just fall apart for me, because I'm just like, well, listen, I know this symbolism pretty well. I've seen this symbolism in action, and I've been documenting this for a long time, and I just don't see that. So, but like, you know, Downard's an interesting case because in some ways, he's kind of like the founding father of synchronicities. You know, if you take Jung out of the equation, you know, I would argue that Jung is. But, you know, he's working before the internet, you know, so he's kind of doing like the hard work of going to libraries and looking through microfiche and all this kind of stuff. And that was I used to do work like that. I used to do synchronistic work before it was called that. Like, that's how I was doing shit in the 90s, right? Because the internet was pretty limited until the World Wide Web really takes off, and you know, then you start to like Google and stuff. When Google
we had news pages. No one remembers like news pages that you'd have to
news groups.
The news groups. Yeah. That was so, like when I caught on to the internet. That was kind of phasing out.
Well, it's like I remember those days when you know, spending time in the library and like looking through indexes and card catalogs and all this kind of stuff, doing the hard work. So I understand, Downard. It's like you get very like, you know, very possessive, because every morsel that you get, you fought really hard for, and you're not going to let go of it. But, you know, the thing that I always bothered me about Downard is just like, well, it's kind of close to, or it's similar, you know, it's like all this kind of like horseshoes and hand grenades kind of shit, where it's just like, it is, but it isn't quite, and, you know, and all this kind of stuff, where it's just like, it's very approximate. And I found that really frustrating, because that to me is cheating. And that, like, when normies hear that stuff, they just go, shut the fuck up.
I know. And that's what bothers me the most. And that's, I mean, it's a mountain to climb for a lot of us that are doing this work together, but it's like we got to refine our level of discernment in this community. I think I get deep into the UFO topic a lot. I know you cover it here and there. I know we're not planning on talking about that tonight. It's an entirely different conversation, but it's like, yeah, I look at UFO Twitter and it's just a scourge upon the observation and study of conscious experiences. It's the saddest state, you know.
No, UFOs are bad news. I'm kind of like I'm very much like Keel now.
Okay, ultra terrestrial perspective more so.
I've kind of always been like in that regard, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is that starting in 2015, you know, my family and I had like one 2015, one in 2016, and one early 2017 had really startling observations, close encounters. I don't know. The close encounters are the first kind, second kind. I don't know what you call it.
Mm-hmm.
But my son and his friends had videotaped. I mean, this is like this is 2000. He had like this old, I mean, I've still got the video. I mean, you can see what it is, but it's not a great, you know, it's low res old iPhone shit.
Right. That's the rule.
But the other thing too is that a lot of times these are not like actual physical objects, but there are all these UFOs sort of hovering over this golf course that he worked at. He worked at this golf course, very exclusive kind of place. And there were all these UFOs, and you know, he went out and bought like a really expensive camera, but then like he kind of thought about it and he's like, I don't want anything to do with that shit, because like some other bad things were going on. They're like, oh, these UFO encounters, whatever you want to call them, were sort of going hand in hand with like a lot of bad things that were going on, you know, in our lives, right? And you know, the last one was in February 2017, and it was a chevron-shaped UFO, and it was like just sitting over our neighborhood for like, I don't know. We got bored of watching it. We were like watching it for 20 minutes, and it was doing like these weird kind of like lateral movements, you know, up, straight down, straight back, straight forward, like just these weird, and it was chevron shape. And a week or so after we saw it there were some videos that showing up on YouTube, like in Texas and Colorado, of these same things. So, but you know, just sitting there watching that thing for 20 minutes, I was just thinking, I'm not getting a good feeling from this. You know, I don't know what that is. I don't know what's behind it. It's clearly some sort of intelligence. It's clearly a structured craft that does not look for the life of it to be aerodynamic in any way, shape, or form. Why is it there? It's just, I just didn't like it. You know, and interesting. Yeah. And you know, because I had been like really almost like maniacal with the UFO stuff for a while. And then after that, I'm kind of like, I don't think so. And then what just killed it forever for me was that whole Tom DeLonge bullshit that took place like just a couple days after the thing in Las Vegas. You know, I credit Tom DeLonge for really killing the UFO conspiracy field, which was probably the idea.
Probably, you know? Yeah.
Because
like UFO conspiracy, do it.
Yeah, because UFO conspiracy stuff was pretty hot at the time, and yeah, I mean, there's still UFO, like I guess, you know, like the Black Vault and Nick Pope, you know, just the usual suspects and so on, but it's not what it was at all.
No,
you know,
it's definitely been even more than it ever was.
Well, yeah, it's been co-opted by, you know, all these CIA goons, but yeah, I just tell people, just there's nothing there for you.
That's what
there's
I say.
Nothing to be gained, you know. There's nothing there to learn. There's nothing there to be gained. There's nothing there that's going to help your life in any way. It's just,
and they would argue tooth and nail that the technology that will be brought forth is going to transform our lives, and it's only coinciding with the Great Reset as a coincidence. You know, all this AI and alien, and it all fits the bill to me. I mean, it's just a clear psy-op. But let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart and yours. Boston hardcore, man. It was so cool to find out that you were from my neck of the woods and grew up immersed in this hardcore community. It's definitely nothing now. It doesn't really exist too much in the Massachusetts area that I've been to. Metal has kind of taken over, and I favor that usually these days anyway. But the heyday, the chaos of most of what I missed because I was too young. But I mean, Jerry's Kids did like a reunion tour in like the early to mid 90s. I was too young for that, but I was enthralled in all that older Boston music and just everything about it. And I just would love to hear your perspective on your times in it. And of course, you kind of have this whole secret history of Boston hardcore, and I would love to hear about that.
Well, it's funny you said Jerry's Kids because I was the original singer, and I actually named the group Jerry's Kids.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Are
you credited in their history and all that? Is there any documentaries about Jerry's Kids? Because there should be.
I'm thanked. There's the All Ages.
Oh, okay.
Boston hardcore, and
that's
there's
right.
like I'm in a ton of that. Just sort of.
I'm gonna have to go back and watch this shit.
Yeah. So Boston hardcore. How much time do we have?
Let's go like another half or 40, whatever we can squeeze it.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say.
Let's take it one step at a time, and we'll see where we end up.
So Boston hardcore is a really interesting thing, and it was a Gen X thing. It really was. You had sort of what they call Generation Jones now, which is sort of like that weird group in between Boomers and Gen X, sort of like early 60s. But Boston hardcore had a very interesting sort of impetus, I think, like origin point, because I don't think it really starts in Boston. I think it starts in Braintree and Quincy, where I was from, because I was right on the I was on the board, like I was literally on the border, like of Quincy and Weymouth and Braintree. It was this area called Weymouth Landing. And East Braintree, where I grew up, was kind of like the dumpy industrial area, because there was at the other end of Quincy Avenue, right up there was what was called the General Dynamics shipyard, and it was this big ass shipyard where they built like LNG tankers and stuff. So this is in Braintree, at least a part of Braintree that I was in, was very industrial. And there was also these there was a big BP, I think it was, had a big like gasoline depot up on the hill there, maybe about a mile from my house. And what they've discovered, the thing was just leaking benzene into the groundwater for years, and they found like these insanely high, this is just a few years ago, they found these insanely high levels of benzene. And but also Braintree, and this is something I didn't learn till later, is that Braintree is really kind of like a gangster town, or it was a gangster. I mean, I don't know if it is now, but for when I was growing up and up until not too long ago, it was, I got like a newspaper.com subscription. I was going back and looking at all these news stories, and there was always like, drug ring this, prostitution ring here, I mean, Braintree was, kind of a hub for it, partly because of its location. But I remember when I was a kid, 1982, one of my friends lived next door to a cop, and knew this cop, and the cop told him and said that there was a prostitution ring going out of the Braintree T station. And it was basically these girls picking up men coming off the train and stuff, taking them across the street to there was this shithole called Sweet Chalet that later became a Motel 6, and there were shootings and, a lot of prostitution in Braintree, right? And I found out like who the girls were, and these were like, freshmen in high school. These are like very, very young girls. And I was just like, it was weird. And it was so funny too, because you talk about hardcore. I remember going to see the Meatmen at the Gallery East, and like I don't know if it was in between sets or something, but I was talking to Tesco V, right? You remember Tesco V, the Meatmen?
I've heard the name, yeah.
Yeah. So they were sort of like, they're kind of like the mentors, kind of like like this really parody kind of, really gross chauvinistic kind of group.
Okay.
But I was talking to Tuscovia, and I'm like, oh man, you got to come down to Braintree, man. You can get some, you can have sex with like high school girls at the train station and stuff. He was looking at me like, who the fuck is this kid? But so the Gallery East was really interesting because that was like at South Station, right? And I knew the guy. I still know the guy who opened that up. It was a karate studio during the day. This guy named Dwayne Lucia, but it was like karate studio. But he also had like art exhibits there, and then they'd have hardcore shows on the weekend. And I think the second hardcore show I went to was there, and it was like SSD, Control, and the Freeze, and like the SSD played for like 20 minutes. Maybe even less. Yeah. And the cops came and shut it all down. And but anyway, so the point is that like East Braintree, East Junior High School. So like Kevin Mahoney from Siege, like, I was in class with him. I knew him. Chris Doherty, Gang Green, obviously, right? Yeah. When there used to be 3 junior high schools. They shut down one of them, and like Mike Dean, Bill Manley from Gang Green ended up going there. So like all of Gang Green went to East Junior High School. Mm-hmm. Dave Aronson, who I was friends with, late day, passed away a little while ago. He went there, and the thing is that like East Braintree, and like I said, it was all this gasoline. This is when there was lead in the gas, and the violence was just ridiculous. Kids were just fighting all the time. And, it turns out they discovered later on that lead, like atmospheric lead, affects the brains, the developing brains of adolescent boys and causes them to be violent. And boy, did I see that every day. It's like, I mean,
I've heard that before in context with like the decades where the highest profile serial killers were operational. And how, I mean, that's all those kids that were growing up with lead as everyday, byproduct of their lives. So it might be.
Yeah. So like I said, it's even worse because there was that big BP gasoline depot, right? And then there's all the other contaminants that are leaching into the soil. And of course, this is like right up the hill from like Watson Park, where we all played Little League. And then there's a beach there where I used to go with my mom. It was called Swift's Beach. And they shut it down because Boston Harbor got so polluted from all the sewage and stuff.
Right.
So, so East Braintree is really kind of like, I don't want to say that it's kind of like the spiritual godfather, because like I said, a lot of people in these groups went to East Junior High School. And what I wrote about in the Endless American Midnight, I've got a new edition of that out, by the way.
Awesome.
There's a teacher at East who was a major pedophile and had a harem of boys. Everybody knew about it. Whoa. Every freaking kid in school knew that, knew who this guy was, knew what was going on, knew who his boys were. Kids and parents would complain about it to school board, principals. Nothing was done about this guy until 1980. So until, this cohort of like a lot of these kids who ended up in these hardcore bands, Kevin Mahoney, Chris Doherty, Mike Dean, Bill Manley, Dave Aronson, like sort of these like key people in Jerry's Kids and Gang Green, and also Siege, right? I mean, Siege, some of the guys in Siege were from Weymouth, and Weymouth is another story. Weymouth was just a fucking madhouse. But it was just like, it was like South Boston writ large. But yeah. So you just grown up in this environment where like, you have like open pedophile, just like pimping boys, clearly pimping boys out. Because when they finally arrested this guy, they found him off the coast of Florida on a 52-foot yacht.
Holy shit.
Yeah. And like, you tell me how like a junior high school teacher in the 70s had the bucks to buy that kind of fucking boat.
Right.
You know what I mean? But this is like, so this is Braintree, like there was all the, all the stuff with the Catholic priests, like some of the worst priests, like Gagan and Shanley, had posts at Braintree at one point or another. There was this weird kind of youth group going on that had some like dodgy stuff going on. And actually the Archdiocese of Boston is located in Braintree now, because the guy who was really running was really running the diocese was this guy named Flatley, and Flatley was this kind of like almost like a Donald Trump guy, but just had a much lower profile. But he was based in Braintree. He owned all this real estate and so on, and he was basically keeping when all those lawsuits started happening, it was like his money that was keeping the diocese afloat. And when they finally had to sell the building, he just moved him into one of his properties in Braintree. But there was also this case that I also write about in Endless American Midnight, where this girl named Diane DeVana was tortured and raped and murdered by her family. And this was like 1978, when the story came to light, and like everybody was just traumatized by it. Like when the news came out, and it was so horrific. It was like medieval. It was just, what they did to this girl was just unimaginable. And, you know, there's this weird kind of connection with the whole pre-scandal with that situation, but, you know, it's too much to go into. But the point is that there was just, you know, the sense that there was just so much violence. Like there would be fights every day, like basically right outside the front door of the school, like down this hill. There was like the big path and the little path, and there'd be fights every single friggin' day. And like something would be like, there'd be like 2 or 3 fights going on. It's like, who do you want to watch fight? You know, I'll watch this fight. And like, you know, like walking, East Junior High School boarded this kind of Section 8 apartment complex called Monatic Village. There was just all sorts of chaos and debauchery going on over there. And like, you know, walking to school every day, unless I wanted to walk like way out of my way, I had to go through this path. And it was basically just like an open air drug bazaar every day, where like kids from the high school would come down and sell drugs to junior high school kids, 6th graders. I mean, you know, it's like I knew what microdot was when I was in 6th grade. It's just friggin' ridiculous. Yeah, so anyway, so I mean, I think that a lot of this was what was really feeding into the spirit of Braintree hardcore and Boston hardcore, because really what you really starts with, in my estimation. So Jerry's Kids was me, Dave Aronson, Brian Jones, and Brian Betzger, right? And Brian Betzger and you know, everybody at me was in the lineup that records on This Is Boston, Not LA, right? But Bob Sensi and Rick Jones were in a band called the Insects, INSEX, and they had this drummer. The drummer was this kid named Walter, and he went away to college, so like they just kind of like merged the 2 groups and kicked me out. And I didn't care, because, you know, there was a lot of really, really fucked up shit going on at home that I can't really go into. But, you know, I just, you know, I couldn't really deal with it. But, so, but it was just that real, like super fucking, you know, 300 beats per minute or whatever. That was Gangrene. That was, because Jerry's Kids, you know, like, Brian Betzger, the drummer, you know, they used his like back porch for the rehearsal studio, and he had like, you know, really nice parents, great family, great house, and great equipment and everything. And so like what Gangrene did, because Gangrene grew out of this group that was just like this garage band with like a keyboardist and stuff, and like keyboardist and the singer left, and it was just Mike, Bill, and Chris, and like to distinguish themselves from all the other hardcore, that was like they were going to play 3 times faster than Black Flag. And I remember really clearly. So Springer from SSD came out, right, and he wanted to see what was going on, like what's all the shit going on in Braintree. So he goes to see like Jerry's Kids, and Jerry's Kids were like doing kind of like Black Flag, like that was their whole deal. I mean, I really love that early Jerry's Kids stuff, but they were doing like Black Flag pretty much straight up. And then he goes to see Gangrene, and they're rehearsing in like Mike Dean's attic, and it was like, you know, the fastest of the fast, faster than anybody had heard at that point in time. It was just ridiculously fast, and Spring was he just thought it was the greatest thing he ever heard. He was just like flipping out. He's like laughing. He's like bent over. He couldn't believe it, and but that version of Gangrene ends up playing on This Is Boston, Not LA, but they fall apart pretty quickly because. Like Mike and Bill just weren't into it. They were you know, pretty much kind of, you know, a little more straight up kind of guys. And then Chris Doherty goes to play for Gangrene because Brian Jones, I still remember the show. Brian Jones, who's a singer, Jerry's Kids, breaks his leg on stage at the Gallery East. Was it? I think it was the Gallery East. Yeah. And
a typical situation for a hardcore band back then.
Yeah. And then his mother's just like, forget it. You're not doing it anymore. You're not doing it anymore.
I broke my nose about 5 minutes before I went on stage one time, and then I ended up playing the show with just blood gushing, which was just like, man, this is like an accidental aesthetic. It's awesome. It's just getting everybody revved up. Nobody wants to touch
the Andrew WK aesthetic, right?
Right. Yeah. Accidentally.
Yeah. So that's really kind of the impetus. And like I said, that's like that rage. Like Chris Doherty lived, he lived behind the Quintree Mall. He was like a couple blocks over from Quincy Avenue, and he lived not too far from the shipyard. So, and this is like grim. This is like, stuff you'd hear on like an old, like, I don't know, Clash song or something, like grim industrial, or like a Bruce Springsteen record or something. It was fucking grim, you know what I mean? Yeah. And it's like people in East Braintree, there was a lot of like welfare families, and there was tons of alcoholism, but also tons of like child predators running around. It was just fucked up. It was fucked up. So that rage, I think, really feeds into Boston hardcore, and that makes that differentiates Boston hardcore from DC and New York. I mean, like they had their own situation. Like DC, like those are all like middle class kids. A lot of their families work for the government or for universities and stuff.
Yeah, they were pissed at the government. They're right in their backyard and everything.
Yeah, but the thing is that a lot of them just get sucked up into the system. Like, the great example being, what's the guy's, Lyle Preslar from Minor Threat ends up going to work, as an A&R guy for what was it, a Mago or something. One of those kind of quasi indies in the 90s that gets bought up or something, or was always sort of like an ersatz wing of a major label. So, I mean, like, and then New York was like, that was a whole different scene. Like it's funny because I'm more partial to the New York hardcore than I am to the Boston hardcore.
Like Blood for Blood and shit like that.
No, I'm talking like earlier, like Cro-Mags and.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? Like
hell
that
yeah.
scene. Like Cro-Mags and Murphy's Law and Gorilla Biscuits. Early. Yeah. It's funny because I saw. It was only one of them. So I saw The Young and the Useless, which is one of the groups that sort of became the Beastie Boys, and I think it was Adam Yauch was like the bass player.
Okay.
And they opened up a Public Image Limited, like this crazy ass show, like one of like my favorite shows because it was just so chaotic. Public Image Limited plays 1982 at the Channel, and the Channel was like, that was the big place to go. And but like people were like, it got so crazy. Like somebody like broke their fucking neck stage diving and went right into a column and stuff. And it was just crazy. It was just, like Boston became like really violent, like the scene, like, the Boston beatdown and stuff. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it tried to come back again, like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. It's kind of,
I would say you mentioned Gorilla Biscuits. Gorilla Biscuits seemed to be a real heavy influence, like in the quote unquote scene about 10, 12, maybe even 15 years ago or so in like the Worcester County area. That influence came back with a vicious presence. It was interesting.
That is interesting.
Totally
that's very, it's very unlikely. But, so like the scene, the New York scene was like a lot of homeless kids. And that's why, like, like the Cro-Mags guys got into Krishna, because that was where they could get a meal. Because this is like Lower East Side, you know what I mean? Like all the squats. It was just a totally different scene. But I got to tell you something about the Boston scene. It's really funny because it's like I grew up poor and in a very chaotic home environment, right? I started drinking and getting high and everything like 11, 12 years old. I mean, my wife says, my life story is like the kind of life story you hear all the time on Soft White Underbelly. You ever watch that channel? No, it's like all these like people who end up on the street and everything.
Oh,
but,
okay.
Yeah. So, no, but the thing is like, so most of the kids, you know, like the Braintree kids, you know, like they had nice houses, nice families, intact families, you know, they had parents who could get them nice equipment and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was like a punk rock, you know, like my life was a lot more punk rock, but the thing is, I just wanted to get out of it. I wanted to get away
That's
from
always
it.
the reality.
Yeah, it's like you don't wallow in that kind of underbelly kind of world if you grew up in it. And the other thing too is that my mother was a musician, so I grew up in nightclubs and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's one of the reasons why we were so poor, because she was a musician. But you know, it's for real, right? You know, I grew up in nightclubs. Like some of my earliest memories is this nightclub that was owned by the Irish mob. It wasn't the Winter Hill Gang, it wasn't Whitey, but it was like one of these other mobs. Mm-hmm. And it was this place called Coral Gables in Weymouth on 3A. And like I would grow up, you know, I was like playing with my little Matchbox cars or Hot Wheels, whatever, like 4 or 5 years old. And, you know, she'd be rehearsing. Yeah. But it was like an old school kind of Vegas style nightclub, right? And they were the entertainment, they were the dinner show. So it's like I've been, you know, spending all my time in nightclubs since I could remember. Mm. So like even by the time of hardcore, I was getting kind of fucking bored of it. You know what I mean? It's like I'm getting bored of going to shows. I'm getting bored of that environment, you know, because it's just like it's not as thrilling as you think it is when you grow up in it. You know, it's like all these other kids were like, you know, like I said, had, you know, good families that, you know, had money and they'd go on vacation and, you know, they had, you know, nice sneakers and they weren't wearing hand-me-down clothes and all the shit that I had to deal with, right? And just all the shit that was going on at home, like all the chaos and, you know, all the other shit. So I just wanted to get away from it. You know, I left Braintree as soon as I could. You know, like I said, when I graduated high school and I came down to art school, I was just like, I'm never going back. You know, I just don't want to be there anymore. I mean, believe me, I had a fucking blast in high school. My high school was like, my high school experience was like, you know, it was like Repo Man meets like The Breakfast Club or something. It was just crazy. Wow. You know, yeah, it was that movie. Yeah. It was like, I had a great time, and it's like, but like I said, I mean, it's like, I was like a total, I started skipping every Friday, and then I started skipping every Thursday and Friday. But by the time they caught me, I was just basically going to school on Monday and Tuesday, and sometimes not even then. Like I was just a total truant, getting high, getting drunk. I mean, I was just like, I was a classic latchkey kid, very feral and everything. And then like, you know, it's like because of this lifestyle my mother was involved in, I'm kind of getting exposed to like the seedy underbelly of life at a very young age. You know what I mean? And I just wanted to get out of it. You know, it's like that stuff had no appeal to me. I think when you grow up in a very sedate and stable environment, you want like that excitement. You want that like
contrast, right?
Yeah, that contrast. It's like when you grow up in like poverty and in, you know, in a fucked up environment at home and like being exposed to a lot of stuff that kids really shouldn't be exposed to. It's not as fun as, you know, it wasn't fun for me. So, but so here's the interesting thing though. Like, when you talk about the broader picture here, it's like, to me, like I said, hardcore was a very Gen X thing. And it was like Gen X kids who were just tired of being shut out and tired of hearing about how everything was better in the 60s and tired of like, you know, the boomers just sort of lording over them and telling them that everything they did sucked and was stupid and everything. But it was also, I wrote up this theory, and I talked about it on my rock and roll blog, but like in the era of rock and roll, there was like the turnover with every 4 years, starting in like 55 up till grunge. Like every 4 years, there would be like a turnover. So like 79, you know, before the hardcore thing really kicks in, that's when the new wave stuff starts. You have the Cars and Blondie and Devo and all that kind of shit. And then 83, it's like the British, you know, Eurythmics, and, you know, so there would always be like these, every 4 years, this big turnover. So what was going on with hardcore? It was like they're all little brothers. Like everybody was like the youngest in the family. So you had the big baby boom generation. And like so many of the, you know, if you go through all these like hardcore bands, you're going to find out that so many of them are the youngest kid in the family. And, you know, at a time like in the 70s, like I said, when everything's just going to complete chaos and parents are just letting their kids fend for themselves while they go off to key parties or whatever.
Right.
And, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Because my wife and I were just talking about how like and there's a part of me that does appreciate what the meme is saying. You know, the picture of the bikes out on the street corner with the light post, and you know, back in the good old days. It's like my wife brought up a good point. She's like, yeah, back when parents didn't give a fuck about their kids and they were just everywhere and doing whatever they wanted. Like, yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah, it was, but like I said before, it's like I was exposed to so much shit growing up, like very, very young.
Yeah.
That like I said, the seedy underbelly just did not appeal to me. I mean, like I said, I was growing up near the Weymouth Landing. It's just like me and my friends would like have these shortcuts where we would go down to like, the little convenience store down there. And we'd be going through this alley and they'd be like drunks passed out and they're puking shit. And you'd have to like kind of step over them. And it's like, it's just like, and then
That's
it was
intense.
just like, but it wasn't. It was just like your kids just deal with shit. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah. That's that thing. That's what we pass on Tuesdays.
Yeah. And it's just, it's just the world you grow up in. But like the other shit were like, there were some hairy experiences where like, do you ever see the movie Mystic River with Sean Penn?
That's a Massachusetts movie, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll tell you, when I hear non-authentic Boston accents, it really fucks me up.
Churns my stomach. Every comic has to talk about Dunkin' Donuts. It almost sounds Minnesotan. It's like, get out of here.
Yeah. I mean, I love the movie The Departed, parts of which are filmed at Braintree, right? But it's just like Mark Wahlberg, who actually moved to a block away from my house when what happened is that Donnie Wahlberg got big with New Kids on the Block.
Yeah. And
they were living in Dorchester, and Dorchester was really shit in the bed. And they moved a block away from my house. They were living up on Pilgrim Road, which is, like I said, next street over from me. And my mother said that like when the New Kids on the Block were big, there would all these friggin' girls coming up from the landing with their lunch boxes. They just sit outside his house, like dozens, 20, scores, whatever, like all this whole little army of girls sitting outside the Wahlberg house on Pilgrim Road there. But anyway,
my goodness, I would have loved to seen like the Wahlberg bros having an accidental run-in with like a group of hardcore kids. What would that have been like?
Well, see, that's my next point. So
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So no, but that's a good segue because like I said, so there's this generational thing, there's a Gen X thing, but there's also this sort of sub-generational thing with all the younger brothers. For a lot of these families, like Big Irish, it would be like 5 or 6 kids, and they're like the afterthoughts, right? And but also the all the like the Southie boys would basically ride the T on Friday and Saturday nights and start fights with people, and not even like start fights, but just like you'd be like one guy sitting there and like a bunch of South boys would come up and just start wailing on him and stuff. I mean, Boston. And what had happened? What had happened is that you had so there was a first wave punk rock scene in Boston, and sort of like the big bands from that are like Unnatural Acts. They saved Hitler's Brain, and La Peste did Better Off Dead. And well, I guess Mission of Burma is a little bit later, but there were a few groups, and there was like the Real Kids and the Nervous Eaters and stuff, all of which just became sellout bands. But so there was a punk scene, and a lot of those bands just burnt out really quickly. And then there was like all that shitty arty new wave kind of shit, like Oingo Boingo kind of shit, but like worse. Yeah. You know what I mean? Just like and a lot of it was like all these kids from Berkeley School of Music would like form all these like herky jerky fake sub devo, arty, just really pretentious bullshit music. And one of which was Amy Mann. So I used to see Amy Mann every Saturday morning because we'd all go into Newbury Comics, and this is when Newbury Comics was a literal fucking hole in the wall. I mean, it was literally like a closet that it like from it was like the I don't even know what you call it, but sort of like the janitorial area in like one of these big old Boston townhouses. Yeah. I mean, the thing was like, it had to have been like maybe no wider than 10 feet wide. And then it was like maybe, I don't know, 20 feet deep. You know what I mean? And the thing was, but that was like, that's where I got like all those classic hardcore records, and I was buying all my comic books there and stuff. That place was fucking awesome. But anyway, like I'd see Amy Mann there. She was in this really terrible group called the Young Snakes, and there was like like everything was like like all like clean guitars, you know what I mean? Like just
like the pendulum swang away from heavy music entirely.
Well, yes, exactly. And it was like just everything was really dorky and arty. It was all rich kids. It was all like rich kid bullshit, you know what I mean? And so what happened is that a lot of this was kind of like there was the Rat and Cantones and Spit and Metro. I mean, there was just like this little circuit of places that people used to play. But the Rat was in Kenmore Square, and the Kenmore Square on Friday and Saturday nights was just a fucking endless gang fight, because Kenmore Square would be like, you know, kids from Charlestown and Southie and you know, even kids from the North End and stuff, and like basically all these like packs of kids, you know, all wearing like remember those Barracuda jackets, you know, those with the plaid inset and the you know, like sort of like golf jackets, whatever. And they just beat the shit out of like people coming out of the Rat. And like that's kind of like how the scene, that new wave scene, kind of ran aground, because the violence, they were just like sitting ducks. You know, you come out of the Rat after seeing a show and you're just getting beat up by these scumbags, you know, from, you know what I mean? From like sort of the outer rim, right? And, you know, they call them wolf packs, right? And so that sort of killed that scene. So when hardcore comes around, like people sort of, you know, understood you know, they understood what was going on. You know, you know, you'd go into Boston, you know, a lot of times you'd have to fend for yourself against these fucking people, you know, these little gangs, these little wolf packs. So, you know, as soon as kids start walking around with like, you know, wearing army boots and shaved heads, you know, all those fucking Celtic kids, they just back off, because it's, you know, it's like, oh, that doesn't look like an easy target. The kid looks like he can probably handle himself, you know?
Right.
But that was a big impetus because of the violence. I mean, this is like, you got to remember that like Boston in the 70s, you had the whole busing thing and desegregation and stuff. And there was just a tremendous amount of like brawls, open air brawls all over the city. All the shit was going on. So you just grew up in an atmosphere of violence. You know what I mean? It was not the Boston of today. It was sort of this working class city with this upper crust sort of at the margins of it. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
And like I said,
the animosity of the many.
Yeah, like all these rich college kids, you know, going to Emerson and you know, the kids going to Berkeley. Yeah. But like, so SSD, one of their early songs, I think it was like one of their first songs, was How Much Art. And you know, I knew all those guys. Springer was from Quincy, right? So he's like a wholly different animal, because Al, I think, was from Revere.
Fucking Revere, kid.
Yeah, like Revere. And that was like the whole Revere Beach scene. That was like, you know, just all the Cousins with their Camaros and the Trans Ams and stuff. I mean, that was like just a totally different mindset. Springer was from Quincy, and it was this high school that there were a lot like Paul Fox, who was a singer in Jerry's Kids for a while when Brian couldn't sing. But there was this band. So there's this band called the Incinerators from Quincy, and they knew Springer. They were like kind of hanging out with Springer. That was the first show I went to, and it was in one of the Incinerators' basements. And I swear to God, it was like the best hardcore show I went to. It was like this big fucking basement. It had like 10-foot ceilings, you know what I mean? And like everybody there was like the bands. So Jerry's Kids, Gangrene, and the Incinerators play. Everybody there is in the band or is friends with the band. So it was like a really, you know, tight knit kind of thing. But it was like, that was the hardcore ideal. And that was the first hardcore show I went to. And that was like, that's what it was supposed to be like. You know what I mean? It was supposed to be like kids in basements, you know, but it changed really quickly, because so when the whole thing starts up with Gallery East, and then this other place opens up, this place called Media Workshop, that's opened up. This guy named Kevin, this really cool guy, this black guy who was involved with the RCYB which was like this Maoist kind of communist sect. And so a lot of the hardcore bands ended up getting their start there. Like Jerry's Kids' first gig was at Cantone's, and Cantone's, this is like so surreal. Cantone's was a Chinese restaurant during the day and for dinner, and then late night would have bands come in and play. And that was where Jerry's Kids and the Incinerators played there.
That's like such a traditional hardcore story right there, like the double business side of it and everything.
Yeah, because there's
I guess we'll let you play for an hour.
Well, there's Madame Wong's, that the Circle Jerks, and I just want some scan. Let's go to Madame Wong's. I don't know if that was in LA or in San Francisco. There were a couple of those places out west that were Chinese restaurants. Anyway,
that's so funny.
So the Incinerators were like, they were scary dudes. They were like, no, I'm serious, man. They were like, really, like this weird lost breed of like just bare knuckle Boston fighters who just loved to fight, and they loved punk because it was violent.
Right.
And I'll tell you something. So I remember, like, one of the guys in the Incinerators, I was walking to the Jerry's Kids rehearsal studio at Brian Betzker's house, and was walking through the woods, and there was a bunch of burnouts there, and they were always giving a shit. They were like punk rock faggots, fuck you, and all this kind of stuff. And so they were yelling at the stuff, and this guy from the Incinerators just walks up to me and said, like, calm as you can possibly imagine, like, what did he say? Do you want to say that to my face? You know what I mean? And he was so calm, and he was just like, there was like 5 or 6 of these burnouts sitting around this little kind of like a little campfire, and they just shut up immediately because they just knew that this guy was going to bust all their heads in. But anyway, so that was the Incinerators. They were like scary dudes, and they dropped out. Like, they weren't really into the hardcore thing. They were more into traditional punk. But a lot of the people who started showing up are like, like all these jocks from Severian and Don Bosco, and a lot of these kind of preppy Catholic schools, all boys schools.
Yep.
And then and they were all just like hockey jocks. They were just hockey jocks who were there for fucking the fights and stuff. And then there was a lot of skaters that were into the scene, like the big crossover with the skaters.
Big time.
And a lot of the skaters were from Marblehead. And if you know what Marblehead's like, that's like Martha's Vineyard. That's like big money, old money.
Yeah.
Old, like
right
Jake
next
Phelps.
to Salem.
So one of the guys was Jake Phelps. I don't know if you've heard that name, but
I've heard that name, yeah.
Yeah, he ended up being the editor for Thrasher magazine.
Maybe that's where I used to read Thrasher all the time, so that might be where it was.
Yeah, so he was one of the original Marbleheads, and like he came from money. I mean, he was a Phelps. I mean, that's like old line money.
Yeah.
Of course, he was like a fucking gorilla. He was, it's like you never wanted to be near that guy in the fucking mosh pit. We didn't use that name, by the way, mosh pit.
No, I mean, what was it even called at that? That was
slam
no name
dancing.
for it. Yeah, slam dancing, or just
a stupid name.
Getting in there.
Slam. There's that song on This Is Boston, Not LA. Was it Decanids or the Groinoids? Like, gonna slam.
I'll have to look
yeah. So
music I haven't listened to in like 2 decades either.
Yeah, right. So I told you I got kicked out of Jerry's Kids, and I didn't care.
Yeah.
But then I tried out for DYS.
Oh.
Which was Dave Smalley, John Anastas, and I was really good friends with this guy, and I forget his name, but the drummer Dave, I forget his last name. But I was going to be their guitarist. But it's funny, that night I went home, and like the shit hit the fan at home, and like this situation that had been brewing at home, and it's just like I called up John and I said I can't do this. It's like just too much crazy shit going on here. And I was disappointed because it's I mean, I would love to. I didn't really like it was like really it was none of those kids really understood music.
Well, of course not. No, the fighting was priority 1. 2 was the music.
Well, the fighting didn't really start in earnest until like a little bit later. So like 81, 82. And I'll tell you the other thing that was the huge impetus for this. So there was a couple impetuses for this. One of which is that everybody had been like huge into the Clash. And then the Clash started doing like, Rolling Stones kind of shit, what I mean? And everybody was just like felt so personally betrayed by that. They still go see them. Don't don't mistake that. I mean, they still go see those shows and stuff, but they're all just like totally disgusted by all that kind of those records, combat rock stuff they were making. But the other thing that really fired things off was Black Flag played at the Paradise, an all ages show. I think it was in August '81, and this was the lineup with Dez. So this was Dez, Chuck Dukowski, Robbo, and Greg Ginn. This is my Black Flag. You know what I mean? That was the shit that, that, and they just lit the fire. They, after that, it was just like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to get this shit going? Because that was like, nobody had ever seen anything like that. That was just like, you just totally new kind of thing. And I'll tell you something. I remember the week that Damage came out, the album with Rollins came out, right? And we were listening to it on Brian Betzker's stereo, had this bitchin' ass stereo, and we're all just like, this sucks. Oh, we're all just like, Black Flag is over. Like everybody I knew, I'm not kidding, everybody I knew just totally lost interest in Black Flag when Rollins joined the band. We were just like, this sucks. And then when they started doing all that kind of like Stooges shit, like that proto grunge stuff,
yes,
like My War and stuff, I don't know. I swear to God, I don't know anybody who liked that music. Anybody. And we're talking like kids who like, Nervous Breakdown, Jealous Again, Louie, Six Pack, like those first handful. And then, of course, Police Story on Let 'Em Eat Jelly Beans. Black Flag were gods. They were gods. And I'm telling you something, everybody just said, fuck this with Damage. And that was like, it's so weird because for a lot of other scenes, that was their jump off point.
Oh, but anyways, Henry Rollins is the memory that most have if they even know Black Flag, right?
Yeah. I remember buying. I got the State. He was in this band called State of Alert, SOA, and I remember buying. Like I bought all those fucking records when they came out, like all the Discord stuff, and then all the stuff that's coming up from England, Exploited, Discharge. GBH, all that shit, you know what I mean? And then I ended up like making a mint selling that stuff in the 90s. But anyway, because I had like all these original EPs like Blitz and Blitzkrieg and Disorder. I mean, you name it, Crongen, everybody. But anyway, what was my point? Yeah, so that really like people just were not. That's when like Minor Threat really became the move. That was like everybody's loyalties shifted from Black Flag to Minor Threat. Right? But then Minor Threat kind of like they start falling apart. See, the thing is that hardcore back then was high school. That was the shit you were into in high school. And then when you got out of high school, you know what I mean?
That was what New Wave was for.
Well, what happened with a lot of Boston bands when they all got out of high school, whatever, or out of college, whatever. So like, like Rick Jones and Bob Sensi, they were a few years older than us. But anyway, so when the bulk of the audience kind of gets out of high school, that's when you have like SSD does How We Rock. They try to turn into a metal band and just kind of fail miserably. Like Gangrene were able to make the leap because like Brian Betzker, who I think is like one of the best drummers ever. I'm not kidding. That guy was amazing. It's funny because I would go, you got to check out this hardcore band. And like this back in like the 80s and 90s, people were like, yeah, whatever. And no, seriously, listen to the drummer. It's like, yeah, I know what they do. They just do,
right.
It's like, it's like a 2-2 beat. You know what I mean? It makes it sound fast because it's 2-2. I'm like, no, it's not Brian Betzker. And like I used to love like playing like Jerry's Kids, Is This My World? And like people would be like, everybody was just like, how is he playing that fucking fast? I mean, he was just ridiculously fast. So then, so Gangrene sort of, they win the Boston Rock and Roll Rumble, I think in '86. But Chris started having a lot of substance abuse problems and stuff. Well, he had them before, but then you sort of have like the next wave, and you have like who was it, like Moving Targets? You remember Moving Targets?
It sounds familiar. I'm sure.
Yeah, they were a really good band, but then like the hardcore thing dies, and a lot of these bands like the FUs become the Straw Dogs. Jerry's Kids do like they they don't go metal. They sort of do like a more traditional punk kind of deal. But you know, it was just kind of over. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, look at the Minor Threat's broken up. Black Flag breaks up. Bad Brains sort of turned into a groove metal band, but then HR's in prison. I'll tell you, one of the shows that blew everybody away was Bad Brains. I think it was at Bunratty's. Negative Effects opened up. Rick Ocasek was there, by the way, because he was going to produce their album. And I was in the pit during Negative Effects set. I got slammed by somebody's boot right in the mouth, and I'm just like, blood is just pouring out of my face. I go back to the bar, and like I'm like taking all these like bar napkins, trying to get all this blood that's coming out of my mouth. And Rick Ocasek is looking at me like, what the hell? I mean, I'm like 15 years old. Right. And what I had to do, since all my teeth were knocked loose, is that I had to I pretended that I fell on the stairs at school, and I went to the nurse, and I'm like, oh, I got to go to the dentist. I just fell on the stairs, you know, because I didn't want my mother to know that I'd gotten booted in the face. But that was one of the best shows I ever saw. I mean,
that's usually how it goes.
Pure level of energy that band put forward. And it was funny because they were like, before the show, they're all out in their van. They're all just like smoking these giant blunts, and they're all like, "Oh, Jah Rastafari," you know. They're doing all, and we're like, "Oh my God, what we just watch the Wailers now, right?"
It's such a that's such a weird transition.
And but everybody just they couldn't believe it. So that was one of the seminal shows. Was that show? Another seminal show was Mission of Burma at Bradford Hotel Ballroom. They were supposed to be their last. You know, they got back together later on. But they played at Bradford Hotel Ballroom. Negative Effects opened up again. And I think Dangerous Birds, who was one of those sort of arty new wave bands. But that was a big show because, like, you know, kids were going so crazy that the hotel called in the cops. And you can see videos on this online. This is like phalanx of cops lining the stage. You know what I'm saying? Because it was getting so crazy. But you got to remember, like, kids are, you know, I mean, 15, 16 years old. I mean, nobody had tattoos. Yeah. You know, nobody had piercings. I mean, these were just, you know, we were all just kids. I mean, we were kids. We were babies, you know. Jerry's kids, I mean, the oldest member of the band at the time was like 18 years old, 19 years old. You know what I mean? It's like these are teenagers. This was a teenage scene. And I remember, like, I remember when I think I went, I did. I went to the one recording sessions. Yeah, that's right. I remember that night driving into Boston because Jerry's kids were going to, I think it was one of the only recording sessions they did for This Is Boston, Not LA. Yeah, that's right. I remember going in that night into town because they had to record late at night because, that, you know, Mike Dries, who owned Newberry Comics, was paying for all this, and he didn't want to pay for prime hours, so you had to record like late at night. But anyway, so Dickie Barrett from you know, he was always around, and his brother was always around. You know, they were both like prep school kids. You know, boys' school.
Yeah, I went to a Xaverian high school for 2 years, and let me tell you,
where?
Right in Shrewsbury, St.
No,
John's.
no kidding.
Yeah, it was. Okay. Yeah, they had no stairs because ferries could fly. I heard it all the time because it was all boys' school. But I'll tell you, man. Yeah, years later, at all kinds of metal and hardcore shows, I would see so many faces from those 2 years at that Xaverian school. It was all the higher preppy kids that were super into it. I was one of those middle-class kids that was drawn to that contrast big time. But I mean, middle class or not, I felt completely disaffected because of the way I thought about things anyway. But yeah, I hate to cut this a little shorter. I mean, we could go on for a lot longer, and maybe we could do a part 2 because I feel like there's more to be said. But
am I getting like a little too granular here?
Not at all. I don't think so. It's just unfortunately we got to cut it right around now because I'm going a little late, and my kid needs stories read to him. I'm at that stage right now. So.
Oh, okay. Where are you living now?
What's that, man?
Where are you living now?
I'm up in Leominster near Fitchburg. So I remember And there's many of these around, but Twin City hardcore between Fitchburg and Leominster back in the day, you know.
So when did you start going to shows? Like what year was that?
I started going to shows way late. So I was probably 2000, 99, 98, something like that. We go to like what was it called? There was a place in Worcester that held shows, and it's not the hardcore that you grew up with by any means. That was kind of, like you said, that died, and a lot of different genres came in and took over, all these different forms of metalcore and rapcore and shit like that. But the audience,
it was all musically. I mean, the thing is like that was all music. Yeah, it was exciting to be around the scene. But
yeah, it was all the audience, man. We were all the same kind of kids that wanted to take out aggression on everything. Yeah, it was the Espresso Bar in Worcester. That was like our local spot where people would just break everything, and cops were called a lot and shit like that. But,
well, let me tell you, I want to tell you a story, though, one last story, because this sort of speaks to, you know, how I think Braintree was kind of like the spiritual center of the first wave of Boston hardcore. Because like I said, I mean, Jerry's Kids, Gangrene, and Siege, right? I mean,
yeah,
those are
it's a trifecta.
That's kind of a trifecta, right?
Yeah.
So I was going to shows a lot, but there was a certain period that I just started getting bored. I was getting really bored with it because the music really wasn't any good. And I remember like one of the shows I saw the Misfits play the channel.
Nice.
And well, yeah, but they played too long, and it's like it just sounded bad, you know. They had Robo, I thought was a great drummer, and I remember hanging out with Glenn Danzig and talking comics with him before the show and stuff. He was a total geek. This cool. before the steroids and stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway,
when he was still a little guy with the short hair.
Yeah, so I started hanging out with like a lot of my Braintree guys. You know, I had all these sort of different circles of friends, and like, you know, these are guys who like their craziness was not performative. You know, they weren't acting like they were on camera. They just were like had a lot of energy that they just had to get rid of. Yeah. So what happened is that I remember like Choke from Slapshot, and he was Negative Effects and Last Rites and stuff. Yeah. And actually, if there's actually a picture of me in the CD tray of the Negative Effects Last Rites CD. That's me and Choke at the Media Workshop. Yeah. Nice. Anyway, so he came out to Bob Sensi's house. And because a lot of times we'd meet at Bob Sensi's house on like Saturday night because his grandmother would make pizza and stuff. We'd all just like eat their pizza and stuff and go from there. But he came out with us one night, and Choke came out with us. And it's funny because we're all just like suburban kids. We're all dressed like just t-shirts and jeans and stuff. Yeah. And he's coming on. He's got like the leather jacket and like all black and the boots and the shit. You know, he's just like he's Choke. He's
the image.
So he came out with us, and we had this thing called high-speed car chase we used to do. And what high-speed car chase was is that we'd drive around and look for like I don't know, like I don't even know how we chose our targets, but we'd like just start throwing cans or fruit or something at these cars and until somebody would chase us. So that was our game. Our high-speed car chase, like the stupidest, fucking most dangerous.
This must be a Massachusetts thing or something, man. The antics that I got into, and yes, very similar.
Yeah, so he came out on a night that we were doing a high-speed car chase, and I think that was the night we went up to like in the Blue Hills. There was like a Lover's Lane area. And we went up there and we're just like, one of our guys, this skater kid named Sean, stole a box of fruit, and we're just like fucking whipping it at cars and stuff. And like, so we just like drive up to like a car, like, you know, on Lover's Lane, just start pelting it with fruit and stuff. And then if they didn't want to like start chasing us, we just go like, just crazy shit. Right. And then we did get into a couple of good chases that night. Mm-hmm. And then we dropped Choke. I think we dropped him off at the train station. And then we find out he said, those Braintree kids are fucking crazy.
Dude, I love that because I wanted to say earlier when you originally brought it up, the fact that Braintree is like the spiritual, you know, origin point, godfather of Boston hardcore. And that only makes sense to me on like a fractal level, like of all music. I mean, I don't know how many times as a younger person I was furious every time I heard a metal or hardcore riff that I loved from a decade earlier on some butt rock band being played on WAAF, man. It was just infuriating to see how it always moves toward, like, counterculture inevitably like moves towards the culture in that way. It's something, maybe it is at the root of it. It has something to do with that contrast. And even if it's contrived and you know, predictive programming of some kind, they're so aware of our desire for that contrast, maybe.
Yeah, well, you know, it's a cycle, you know.
Yeah.
Like one of the things that always kind of like surprised me when I was a kid is that I'd see like some really boring stand-up comic on TV and then find out that, oh yeah, Buddy Hackett was like, he was like the king of the dirty jokes back in like the 50s and 60s, you know, like I was like hilarious, you know, or, you know, just all these people that just seemed like they were just sucked into the system and just totally declawed, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard, but it's a cycle. Everything sort of starts off edgy and dangerous, and then just slowly but surely gets absorbed. And like that's one of the things, like I said, one of the impetuses behind hardcore is like we're all just I mean, everybody's like, what are the fucking Clash doing? Like, you know, I remember seeing them in 1980 on the London Calling tour, and it was just like it was like getting hit by a fucking train. I mean, it was just like this wall of fucking pure noise just hitting you like a hammer. And then you like hear these records and it's like,
oh yeah.
Like,
then you have Hammersmith Palais. It's like completely different. Yeah.
Yeah. And, but,
yeah, Joe Strummer didn't have a giant mural on some building back when it was like
well, I gotta tell you, so like, all the hardcore kids went to go see those shows in '82 when they were touring for Combat Rock.
Yeah.
But so you had like the second mini wave. So it was all these kids that like I knew from like the weight room at school and stuff, and like they all showed up when the Clash played in '84 with that new lineup that was sort of like the back to basics kind of thing. And that was like just take the wildest hardcore show that you can imagine and then put it in a fucking 10,000 seat arena. It was the Provic Civic Center. Wow. And it was just like, it was the most insane thing I've ever experienced. I mean, people would just punch each other. like what? Just all these like fights, and like the bouncers were so pissed off because they just got totally overwhelmed, you know.
Yeah,
and
they're not expecting that.
It was you know, I call that my punk rock prom, you know, because you know, me and all my friends from high school, it was like punk rock prom. But like I said, I mean, the thing with the hardcore thing is that it just seemed like, again, like so performative to me. And it always seemed to me like these guys sort of wearing the get-ups, you know, with the boots and the braces and the leather jackets and everything like that. It just seemed to me like so, like, again, like it was a pose, you know, and it was theatrical. And it was like the real wild shit would be out in the burbs, you know, like all these crazy Gen X latchkey kids just totally losing their shit. You know what I mean?
Damn
right. You know, so the other thing I want to tell you, but like, you know, Braintree was just like this weird, you know, it's like Twin Peaks. My friend called it Twin Peaks East. And, but we just took it off for granted. Like, you know, one of the stories I've told is that you know, place I used to play basketball at, like literally right across the street, Whitey Bulger had like one of his goons whacked and thrown in the dumpster. You know what I mean? And this was we were playing basketball. You know? And like, I mean, it happened overnight, obviously, but it's just like, that was kind of just the ambience you just grew up in. You know what I mean? You know, particularly in East Braintree, you know, other parts of Braintree just might as well have been a totally different world. But East Braintree to me was just like, it was fertile ground for hardcore punk rock because of, you know, the industrial fucking wasteland feeling that you had, and then like all the violence, you know, just like trying to like not get your ass kicked on the way home from school by just like some randos. You know what I mean? Just
yeah,
like,
the stories you've told remind me of the movie Suburbia. Many people don't even. I think there's another more popular movie with the same name that kind of.
I know exactly
the punk movie that I'm talking. You know what
yeah,
I'm talking about?
Penelope Spheris. It was
Yes.
She made it after she did Decline of Western Civilization.
Yeah,
so,
man.
So I left Braintree. Last hardcore show I went to was a rather notorious show. It was Gangrene and Jerry's Kids at the Paradise. And it was kind of like the next wave were coming in. And that was like a lot of the street kids and the homeless kids and a lot of like the neo-Nazi shit going on. Like,
yeah.
That stuff started getting really, it started seeping in like 82, 83, but by the 84, 85, it sucked. Because all they did was just show up to start fights. They didn't care about the music. They didn't care about the scene. They just wanted to fucking beat people up. You know what I mean? And it's like I got fucking beat up at that show. I mean, a lot of people getting beat up. And then the bouncers wanted to beat up Rick Jones, Jerry's Kids. It was just ridiculous. And it was just like, this is not fun. Right. You know what I mean? This is stupid. This is stupid. Yeah. It's not sort of like a wild kind of art scene with like violence at the margins. This is just a violent scene with art at the margins. I remember going to see a show. I remember going to see a show in '84, and I think it was in Rosslindale. It was like might have been actually, it was Rosendale or Hyde Park. One of these kind of like places that the only reason you'd go there was to get your ass kicked. You know what I'm saying? So we went to go see this show, this hardcore show. It was like more punk rock show, but like I remember watching these bands play, and like afterwards I go out into the alley, and like the band are getting their fucking faces beat in, like, and I didn't know what was going on. And the weird thing was that it was like this sort of like this. It was like a VFW hall, and there was an outbuilding, like a annex or something. And they're inside this annex, and they're just like these fucking guys are just this 3-piece band. They're getting their fucking heads kicked in. I'm like going, what is going on here? Like, what is this? Like, this is a nightmare world. Like, why? What the hell is this? I mean, I don't know.
It sounds so co-opted. Like, it sounds like this.
It's not even co-opted. It's just
not. It's what you were saying in the beginning about like the lead and the gas and just this life circumstances, that put everyone there.
Well, yeah. But like I said, it just got real. It got real boring.
Yeah.
I got real old, and like between like all the bands starting to play like inept metal and all the stupid violence that was just everywhere.
Yeah.
And just being out of high school and just I didn't want to deal with it anymore. Actually, I think the last show I remember going to see Gangrene and the Circle Jerks on New Year's Eve 1985 at this shitty club in Dover, New Jersey called the Showplace. And there was nobody there. It was like dead. So this is like 1985, and like when Black Flag were on their last tour, when it was just like Rollins and Ginn and a couple like hired guns, and they're doing all the jazz.
What
fucking
is this? What kind
shit.
of music is this?
It's just trash. It's just Greg Ginn is such a fucking asshole. And I'll tell you who else is a total asshole is Jello Biafra is a total fucking asshole too. Just absolute asshole. There's some shit he pulled, but anyway, it's
so
just
you left hardcore behind, and eventually you got into like the Katow twins or whatever, right? That's like the kind of
Katow.
Yeah, what are they called? The
Cocktail Twins.
The Cocktail Twins.
Yeah, but I got into them in '83. I got into them when I was still going to shows and stuff. See, that's the thing. Is like
nice contrast for you.
I go to these hardcore shows, right? But it got to the point, past like mid '82, I wasn't listening to hardcore at home.
Right. Yeah.
I just remember buying a lot of these records and just sucked. It's music you had to experience in person.
Yes, damn right, man. I would agree.
But there would be bands like GBH, I think, made great records, and that was one of the best shows I ever saw. I saw GBH at the Rat, and that was awesome.
That's wild, man. Well, listen, I hate to cut this off, man. This has been fun. This has been awesome. I would love to go even further because I think we should at some point, because all these stories kind of lead into like where we could go with it, with, you know, how heavy music has evolved over time and what aspects of it have clearly been kind of taken in by the system and used by the system. But I think we'll have to do it maybe another time. But this has been really awesome, and I really appreciate all the time you've given me, man. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind telling my audience where they could find you, that would be great.
secretsun.blogspot.com.
Hell yeah. And that's where everything is. That's the hub, right?
Well, you're going to get to, you know, where you need to be. I mean, I've got a Patreon, and I've got a Facebook group, and I've got a Discord.
Yeah.
I've got all these little, I have some private groups. You know, I've got a bunch of stuff going on. But,
deep divers. Hell yeah.
The deep divers. I'm on Twitter, Secret Sun blog, at Secret Sun blog. You know, so I'm not too hard to find, you know, until they start putting the boot down on all our necks.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it always comes in waves, so we'll see what happens. I hear a lot of rumblings, so.
Yeah.
But for now, we'll keep doing what you're doing. I love following you on Twitter. You say a lot of great stuff, so.
Thank you. And thank you for listening to an old man walk down memory lane. Right?
You know, it's a different generation. It's a different decade, but like, I feel a lot of kinship to the stories you were telling, and it was really cool, man. I loved getting a deeper history into the music that I grew up with, partially, especially was so attracted to that contrast, like we were talking about, you know? So thank you. Really appreciate it. All right, everybody. Well, this has been real. It's been awesome. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And go check out Chris's stuff. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deep Share Podcast. If you want to hear more, then hit that subscribe button. Follow me on all the social places. And remember, think for yourself, but don't always believe what you think. Till next time.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Enough, I get the point.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
What do we know? What do we know? If I know what we know, then I can tell you what we know, and if someone else knows, okay? I mean...